moving on to chapter 2, you should have the outline for chapter 2.
So what you have in here is your PowerPoint.
Yes. Exactly, and that's a great question. So the statement you made is that the PowerPoints are summarizing what you're going to need to know for the exam, and that's exactly how I put this together, is so that when you're studying, you wouldn't have to necessarily start reading or rereading your book. You can go to your PowerPoints. Now, feel free to make notes in your book as well, but you can certainly just mark up the PowerPoints in the 3-ring binder. So, chapter 2, land characteristics and acquisition. If you were to look at the first page of chapter 2, you'd see some key terms or some key words. And that's true with every chapter at the beginning. Some chapters have a lot of vocabulary words, some don't. Chapter 2 really isn't too difficult to get through. Chapter 3 has more, and when we get to chapter 5, you're going to see a lot. Chapter 5 is one of the more meatier chapters in this book. So, chapter 2, land ownership, is our first slide. So, up here on the screen, if you want to follow along, or you can follow along in your notes. Feudal is one type of land ownership. That's where all the land is owned by the king. If you enjoy watching those medieval movies, you might have an understanding of feudal type ownership. And this isn't just specific to England. If you go over into different parts of Asia, it's the same thing. And depending on your position in society, will delegate how much land you're going to actually possess or maintain. Because, again, it's not really your land. It all belongs to the king. So if the king wants to take your vineyard that you have been managing for the last 15 years, by all means, they can. We know that's not the system in America, right? America has an allodial system where at the beginning, sure, the government has ownership of the land, but we want to pass that on to the individual. We encourage land ownership. And so we give through a land deed. This Homestead Act of 1862 is how originally land was transferred. There were some requirements in this allodial system for a person to acquire land, but if they met the requirements, through this Homestead Act of 1862, they would receive what's called a land patent, and that would be their kind of certificate or their title of ownership, that this is my land. And so this was done to stimulate settlement across western U.S. If you look back at U.S. history, we know predominantly that eastern and northeastern seaboard was pretty much what was occupied, and we wanted them to go west. And so by giving them land, if they met requirements, was a way that we could do that. Characteristics of land. There's 3 characteristics of land, and this is going to just tell us that, hey, what I'm looking at, this is land. This is how we define that this piece is land. There's going to be another category that you'll see after this that are the economic characteristics of land, but the first one is the physical. Again, the physical is telling us that what I'm looking at is land. So underneath these 2 categories, the first one we'll see, number 1, is immobility. Land is a permanently fixed location. It's not going anywhere. Number 2, it's indestructible. It continues to exist. When we have ownership of a piece of land, we own that land all the way down to the Earth's core. Let's say we own this chunk of ground. And this is Earth. We own this piece of ground all the way down to the Earth's core. So even if we do some digging, there's still more land there. We do some more digging, guess what? There's more land. So it's indestructible. And then next, it's non-homogeneous or non-fungible. I'm sure those are words that you guys use in your everyday vernacular, right? So when we see words like this, non-homogeneous or non-homogeneity or non-fungible, I actually had to take a 2-week course just to learn how to enunciate these words. But when you see these words, it's a good indicator that you're going to see it on an exam. When they have words that are outside of what we would use in our everyday vocabulary, they'll probably put it on an exam just to see if you know what the word means. And so these are longer words. You know, they're more than just one syllable, but the definitions are pretty easy. Non-homogeneous or non-fungible simply means that there are no two parcels of land that are alike. And because they're not alike, you can't substitute one for the other. So like a snowflake, right? There's no two that are alike. Like human beings, there's not one person that's the same as another one. Even identical twins. There's still some discrepancies. So, if I look at two parcels, say I have these two parcels, and I know my drawing may not look that way, but these are both going to be the same dimensions. They're going to be 70 feet by 100 feet. So my two drawings I have up here, one is 70, or they're both 70 feet by 100 feet, and they're side by side. Let's say we put sod on both parcels, and we watered it, we mowed it, we just mowed it, both parcels, we kept the mower deck at the same height on both, and you can't see the boundary lines in between or on the sides, and you might say, well, it's the same piece of ground. But if I was to stand in the middle of both pieces, my view, although it may overlap at times, is still going to be different. You drive into a neighborhood where we call these cookie cutter houses, where it seems like every house looks about the same. And you might have two houses side by side. They're both identical. They both are split foyers. They both have the same siding, same color, same roof, same interior floor plan, same carpet, even the same number of nails used to build the house. If I stand in the front picture window of both houses, again, my view, although similar, is still going to be different. In one house I can see more to the left, then in the other house I can see more to the right. And that's how it works. So land is non-fungible or non-homogeneous. Next is the economic characteristic of land, and this is going to attribute value. And I want to make sure you remember that, because on a test they're going to use these 7 total. We have 3 for the physical, 4 for the economic, and they're going to use them all interchangeably to see if you know which ones are defining land and which ones are going to either add or take away from the value of the land. So the first one is durability. And if you look down to the left on your slide, you'll see that it spells out the acrostic DUST, D-U-S-T. And I try to put these in here as much as I can to help you with memorizing. So the first one is durability. And this has to really deal with the improvements. The improvements that are made are not indestructible. If I put in granite countertops are destructible. If I put up a fence, the fence will be there, but it won't be there forever, right? The second that post goes in the ground that I'm using to put my mailbox in with or hang my mailbox on, the ground starts going to work to decompose it. So eventually, that improvement, which would be my mailbox post or my fence or my granite, is going to fall away, whereas land, it doesn't. So that's going to be one. The next one is utility. That's the function that in which I can use this land, or it's the use that this land has. So if I see some ground that is zoned commercial, and that's what I'm looking for, it's going to have a better value or higher value on it than a land that is zoned maybe industrial or zoned for residential. Scarcity is the S in the dust, and this means that there's a limited amount or finite amount of land. We really can't reproduce more of it. So if I look up along the west coast, for instance, if I wanted to move out to California, and I just had my heart set on some oceanfront property, if it's all sold, it's all sold, right? They can't just go and make more oceanfront property. In the Midwest, we really don't have that issue, but what we do have is things like lakes and golf courses. And you'll see around both that a lot of times there's a residential community built around the lake or around the golf course. And once all those lots are sold, that's it. Unless they add another 9 holes to the golf course or they dig another lake out, that's it. That's all that you have available. And on that note, the first lot, for instance on a golf course, always sells for less than the last lot. For instance, I helped a gentleman buy a lot out at a golf course just north of town here in Del Rapids. And they bought a lot on the golf course when it was just starting to really take off. And I encouraged him to possibly buy some more lots. I just dropped that seed out there, and it didn't stick. Called me up about 6 months after the fact. They finished after closing, they finished their new construction project, and he said, I'm kicking myself because I wish I would have bought 2 more lots because now they've doubled. Because, again, once all those lots are sold, they're sold. And so if I have 1 lot remaining on the golf course, it's going to sell for a lot more than that first lot that was sold. Because at the beginning, we're kind of taking a gamble. Is this going to be a worthwhile venture or not? Once it's all set up, everything's all built, it's established that it's a good deal. Transferability is the final one. That's the T. And transferability also has a word that isn't common to our everyday vernacular, and that's the word situs. And so I use the T for transferability so I can spell out the word dust, but situs is probably the one you're going to see on a test. And this has to simply do with location. Again, we see a word like non-homogeneity and we think, oh, that's got to be a complex definition, and it's really not. Same thing with situs. We're just talking about location. In fact, you can take situs and think of the word site, like a job site, right? If I'm going to work on a job site, it's that location, that particular place. So location is another thing that either adds or subtracts from value. And if you ever remember the old or heard the old real estate adage, what are the 3 most important things in real estate? Exactly. Location, location, location. So that being said, in this area, if you have a buyer that grew up on the east side of town, chances are they will not want to buy a house on the west side of town. There's not really any people that live north or south that are geared that way, but it just seems east and west, it's just that mindset. If I grew up west side, I'm definitely not going to live east side, okay? And so a location to them, if they grew up east side, they would pay a little bit more money for a house on the east side versus a house on the west side because that's where they want to simply live. Some people love the southeast part of Sioux Falls. Some people love the central part of town. It's more, I don't want to use the word eclectic, but you don't have just every house looking the same. You might have a large 2-story here, then you have a Tudor style and next to a Victorian, and so on. And you just have more diversity. And usually the neighborhoods are more established, right? And you'll hear buyers say a lot of times, we want to live in an established neighborhood. And I always thought that way too, until I moved into an established neighborhood, and I happened to live now on a corner lot with 12 trees. And so 12 trees in the country is wonderful because I can just rake the leaves in the fall and burn them. They don't like that in the city when I do that. So it's I might give up the living within the established neighborhood, but it does have its pros and cons. But again, its location, that's going to give you your value, either taken away or adding to it. Value, while we're on that subject, there's a definition. The prior physical characteristics help determining that it is land, but these four elements attribute to the value. So again, please remember this acrostic, DUST, and that these are the ones that either add or take away from the value. Real property rights is the next one. I just want to get through the first term, hereditament. Hereditament. When I think hereditament, I think hereditary. And really, the definition for hereditament is that all property is inheritable. So it might be a good way or good help for you to remember that word. The next three, we have land, real estate, and real property. Land, remember my picture from earlier when I was describing the physical characteristics of land. It's from what you own all the way down to the earth's core. That's land. Real estate is land plus improvements. So we have the land, and we put some improvements on it, like a mailbox and a house. Primarily, the house is going to be the improvement that we think of when we think of land or real estate. So real estate, we are real estate agents. We're helping people sell and buy real estate, land plus improvements. Real property is a little different. It's the land plus improvements plus interest or ownership. And that's what I want you to think of when you think of interest. Unless it's a specific mortgage question, they're talking about the interest on a loan. Interest is going to mean possession or ownership. If you look in your book on page 19, you'll see at the bottom of that page figure 2.2. And it's this bundle of sticks. You'll see all these sticks with a nice little twine wrapped around them. And each one of those sticks has a name. And so that's also another word or term that we'll use for interest or ownership. Also, we can call it bundle of rights. So those four different terms all mean that the same thing, ownership or interest. So if you have a house that you own or you live in, maybe you don't completely own it, you still have a mortgage on it, you would fall in, or your house would fall into this category, real property. It's the land plus improvements plus your bundle of sticks. You have this bundle of rights. And we'll talk more about this as we go on. On that picture, like I said, every one of those sticks has a name. And you don't have all of the sticks. You have most of them. If you are paying a mortgage, then there's some sticks out there that the lender has. But when you pay off the mortgage, you get those sticks from the lender. In South Dakota, the lender actually holds a lien on the property. And so when you pay off the mortgage, that lien is released, and those sticks come back into your little bundle. Okay? Guess what, though? When you rent out a house, let's say you have an apartment. You own the apartment building, but you're going to lease out some of the units, or even maybe you're going to rent out your house. You're giving some of those sticks in your bundle to those tenants. They get some of the sticks. They don't get all of them, but they get some of those sticks. The government has some sticks as well, and you'll never, ever get those. They're not going to give those sticks up. We'll look at those when we talk about the 4 government powers. But those are the sticks that the government has. So that's what I'm talking about with that bundle of rights. To define it, it's all legal rights that accompany ownership. It includes sticks that would be called possess, exclude, sell, lease, will, exchange, etc. Each one of those ones I listed would have their own stick, and it would be included in that bundle of rights, like on that picture in the book. Some of those rights that we have are surface and subsurface rights. If you were to look in the book on page 20 at the bottom, you'll see a picture. It says the rights in land. You'll see a house. Above it are air rights. On the surface are the surface rights, and then below that are the subsurface rights. And these can be sold. When we sell a house, we're selling all those rights to the new owner. But you can sell air rights, and you can sell off even subsurface rights. It's probably more common, especially in this area, and even north, like North Dakota, or western South Dakota, that you sell off subsurface rights. Anybody take a stab at something you might sell off that's subsurface? Oil. Exactly. Oil. If you have oil, you can sell that off to a company that can tap into that and mine it out, mine out those resources. Here, around this area, you'll see in certain, they used to be pastures, or maybe they were fields at one time, but you'll see farmers sell off their subsurface rights for gravel pits. Companies go in and they just mine out all the gravel, and that would be an example of that. When you do that, you'll see at the bottom of this slide, what's that called is profit apprendre. That's the process or act of you selling off those subsurface rights so somebody else can go in and mine out those resources. Profit apprendre. Please highlight that. When's the last time you used profit apprendre in a sentence? Not for a while. Not for a while. So please remember profit apprendre. It's the act of selling off those subsurface rights. Air rights. I said you can sell these off. An example of an air right being sold off is if you ever were to head to Chicago or down to Tulsa. You might have driven underneath the McDonald's. Has anybody driven underneath the McDonald's in those roads? Yep. That's an example of an air right being sold. McDonald's there's an arch over the interstate. McDonald's is sitting on that. That's an air right. They're in the air. That's an air right being sold. So McDonald's owns those particular air rights over the interstate. It's kind of a treat because the one I was in, the one going to Tulsa, they have this, it's a thick plexiglass portion of the restaurant where it's see-through, the floor is, so you can like stand on it and watch the cars below. So it's pretty cool. That's an example of air rights being sold. Water rights are another right that can be bought or sold. And the two things under water rights, these are a little easy to remember because of the way this definition works out. First we have riparian, and riparian is a moving body of water or a river. Riparian, river. We have a moving body of water. Littoral rights is a non-moving body of water, and our example for littoral, or a non-moving body of water, is a lake. And then we have this doctrine of prior appropriation that has to deal with water rights. And this primarily comes into play in the western states, such as Colorado. And this law states that the first to put the water to use is the first one that receives the benefit of it. I have a short video that I'll show you that explains that. Before you watch it, though, I want to set it up. It kind of starts out as a little story. There's a young man walking up this creek, and he kicks over this metal bracket that's sticking up from the ground, and what that bracket does is actually keep the water flowing in the stream. When he kicks it over, it diverts the water onto his property, and his property is actually drying out. And so it turns into the story between him and this older gentleman, I don't know if it's his grandpa or who it is, about if they should fix it so the water keeps going the way it is, or if he should let the water flow on his property. But it's basically a system to either divert or keep the water going down the channel, and it all falls into play with this doctrine of prior appropriation. So on that same subject of land, and some of this is even caused by water, we have accretion, where we have land gained by a slow buildup. That's accretion. The new land that's there as a result is called the alluvian deposit. So for your exam, we're going to see several hundred different vocabulary words. You will not have a question over every single one because there's a limited number of questions on the test. But you may see some of these as one of the A, B, C, or D answers. And if you're not sure what an alluvian deposit is, and maybe they're talking about the moving body of water right, like a riparian right, but you see alluvian deposit, you're thinking, well, maybe it's that one. So again, it's important to understand these differences in vocabulary terms. Avulsion and erosion are similar in that we are losing land. Avulsion is a rapid loss, and erosion is a gradual loss. And we have examples of erosion here in the Midwest. You'll see farmers put up those terraces on the side of hills so that they don't lose large amounts of topsoil over time. But my wife and I were on a vacation a few years ago. Oh, this was probably 8 years ago. We were down in Cancun, and there had been some hurricanes that came through the prior year. And the resort that we stayed at, 50% of the beach was gone. And that would be, it was a result of the hurricane, but we could put this into that category of avulsion. It's a rapid loss of land. These government powers that I mentioned earlier, remember that there are these sticks that we have, this bundle of rights, and there's some of them out there that the government has that you will not be able to gain possession of. So, the first one is police power. And this is going to spell out the acrostic PETE, P-E-T-E. So the first one is police power. And outside of real estate, maybe think of the cops pulling somebody over for speeding, maybe not using their turn signal, or maybe not taking a long enough stop at a red light or a stop sign. But in the real estate world, I want you to think of something completely different. I want you to think along the lines of building codes, zoning laws, ordinances in the city. Those are examples of police power. Now, all of these powers have to work for the common good or the betterment or general welfare of that community. And so you'll see some towns exercising the police power in the form of an ordinance for the city where they might make it illegal to own a pit bull. That's an example of using the police power. They feel that it's for the overall benefit of that community that we make this breed of dog illegal. Okay? You can see it in building codes. If you're going to build a house, it has to meet this standard. Okay? Next one, the E is, or the first E, is eminent domain. And there's a word that's attached to this. There's a word attached to eminent domain called condemnation. Those two go hand in hand. So eminent domain is basically the government's right to take land. And they do this, or they exercise this power through condemnation. Okay? So, for example, say we have a street here running up and down the city. And on both sides of the street are these houses. These are houses, and the driveways are going out to the street. So their backyards butt up to this street. But as you who've lived in Sioux Falls, or I guess other towns that are growing for that matter, you realize that over time, some of these streets that at one point weren't that busy, now at 8 a.m. and 5 p.m. they're bottlenecking, and traffic has just increased, and these become a nightmare. So the city can come in and widen the streets. How are they going to do that? Well, chances are they're not going to build a thoroughfare or some kind of interstate system over top. So they're going to come in and take land through eminent domain. So what they would do is come in and absorb these people's backyards, so then they can create a second lane or an additional lane. Okay? That's how eminent domain works. Now, if they're going to do that, they have to give that person, that homeowner, fair market value for that land that they're taking. Their taxes should change to reflect that, because the value of their house is maybe $175,000 before, and now after it's only worth $145,000, so their taxes should go down. Exactly. So that's an example of eminent domain. That's one of the more common ways. If it's for the betterment of the city, for the overall good, they can do that. So you'll see where hospitals, for instance, are expanding. And you may have some homeowners that want to hold out. And in this area, for the most part, the hospitals haven't had an issue. Okay? But if you see hospitals or larger corporations that service a majority of that city's people needing some land, the government could step in and say, look, we need this. Now, again, they're not going to just boot the homeowner on the street and say, hey, good luck. Hope you find a place to land. They have to pay them fair market value for that property. But if it's for the overall good of the city, they can do that. And again, they do it through condemnation. The next one, taxation, is the T in Pete. And this has to deal with property taxes and special assessments. Property taxes and special assessments. Now, how property taxes work is if you were to look up your property on the county website, you would see a land value and an improvement value. And then you would see the total assessed value. So let's say our land value is $40,000. And let's say our improvement value is $180,000. So then our total assessed value would be determined by adding the $180,000 to the $40,000, which would give us how much? $220,000. So that's the total assessed value. So using some of the information that we learned already today, you're going to see something in here you might not have seen before. because they're separating out the land, which we know what the land is. That's the surface down to the earth's core. The improvements, which is things like the fence, the trees, the house, the things that we've added to the property. They both have separate values from the city. And when we add those up, that gives us the total assessed value. And then what happens to determine your taxes is it's multiplied times a mill rate. And that'll give you your annual property taxes. The mill rate's the same for every house. It's fair that way. It just means if your house has a higher assessed value than your neighbor's, you're going to pay more in your property taxes. And how they determine the mill rate is we take the entire city budget that's needed for that year, so to pay for all the employees, the new school we just built, the library that we are building, all of that, take that into, we total all that up, and then we divide it by the total assessed values of the properties that are taxed within that community. So we add up all the properties that are taxed, we add up all their assessed values, and we divide it by that city budget, and that gives us a mill rate. And so we take that times our assessed value, and that'll give us our property taxes. We'll talk more about that mathematical process here on a later day. But for now, that's how your property taxes are figured up. Now, some people decide that, let's say I buy a house that has an unfinished basement. Okay, I have 3 bedrooms on the main floor with 1 bath, and the basement's unfinished. And so, you know, I know how to do some construction. You know, I've watched enough HGTV. I think I know how to swing a hammer. I have a cousin who's a plumber, and my wife's uncle is an electrician. So, you know, I don't need to pull a building permit, because if I pull a building permit, my taxes are just going to go up. So they try to get the job done without pulling a permit, and that way their assessed value stays the same. Because the city doesn't know that they added 2 more bedrooms, another bath, and another family room downstairs. So their house might have been assessed at 180 based on the main floor finished and basement unfinished. But now it should have an assessed value of, let's say, $250,000 for the improvement value. And if the improvement value went up to $250,000, you would see a land value at 40, so that's $290,000. You take that times the mill rate, what's going to happen? The property taxes go up. That's all fine and dandy until you go to sell your house. And chances are it's going to come out, at least in the inspection, unless you're honest in the seller's property condition disclosure, but it's going to come out that you didn't get a building permit. And there's a good chance the lender might require that you rectify that before closing. So guess what has to happen? You have to go out and get the permit, pay the fine, and the city will send out their inspectors. And I had this happen on a property once. The homeowners finished off the basement without getting the permit pulled. The electrical inspector came out, and he went around to every single socket. And if you look around your room or your house or even this classroom, you're going to see several electrical outlets, light switches, plug-ins, and so on. And the homeowners had to cut a hole at the top of that outlet, all the way up the wall, all the way across the ceiling to the electrical box, so the wires were exposed, so the inspector could make sure that all the wires were where they were supposed to be, they were using the right wires, they were hung correctly, and so on. So can you imagine getting out your Sawzall and cutting through your sheetrock? It's sheetrocked ceiling, everything's completed. So they had to pull all that out, or cut all those holes in there, and then that wasn't even the nightmare, because they finally got everything approved, but then you have to patch all the holes. Then you have to sand the sheetrock and apply the texture. And then you can't just take out that bucket of paint that you used 5 years ago, because that paint, when it sits for a long period of time, the color begins to change. And so you can't just go over that with a brush and call it good, because your colors aren't going to match. The tint's going to be off just a little bit. So they had to repaint their entire basement. So it was a long process. It added about another 2 to 3 weeks for closing for us. They got it done, but that's what could happen in that type of situation. So the next thing, along with taxation, is our property taxes, but we also have special assessments that I mentioned earlier. And special assessments can be anything from the city coming in and adding new sidewalk. Maybe they're going to add new street lights in your neighborhood. And so then they take the cost of that and they divvy it up among all the homeowners. So let's say we have a property here that the city is going to add new sidewalk. So they're going to add new sidewalk, and the test question could be that the sidewalk costs $25 per foot. And they'll give you a picture that the lot is 75 feet by 190 feet. And so your question is, what was assessed to that homeowner? So, would it be okay if I took the 190 and took it times the $25 per foot to get my answer? They won't say square, but yeah, because we got linear feet, we got square feet, and chances are it's not going to be in the real world something like this simple. But for the test world, they'll keep it simple. They're not going to say per yard and then you have to divide by 3 and no. Well, I say no, and then guess what? But generally, it's going to be a per foot situation. Yep. So you're safe with just knowing the dimensions. If you get a picture, then we would know that it's 190 feet this way. And so they could say it's $25 per foot on the frontage. Oops. And we'll learn about front setbacks, rear setbacks, and side yard setbacks, and so on later. But they're talking about the frontage, which is this way. It's also, if you're looking at a picture, it's whatever direction the house is facing. And so when you see the driveway coming out of the house, we know that that is the direction that the house is facing. So I drew in the sidewalk for you. Chances are you won't have a sidewalk drawn. You'll have to either look at which direction the house is facing, or you might not get a picture. If you don't get a picture and they just give you the lot dimensions and they say it's 85 feet by 60 feet, so I don't even have a picture to go on. I can't look at the house and see which way it's facing because, again, there's no picture. What number do I go by? It's actually going to be the first number. It is a little backwards, but for your test, it's the first number is what you want to use for your frontage. So you might want to take note, because if they don't give you the picture, you're going to grab the first number and multiply it times the amount of feet, or the dollar per foot. And finally, our E is Escheat. This is the fourth and final government power. It's the second E in our Pete, and it's the word Escheat. And this is one that comes in two different forms. It happens when somebody dies intestate. And if they die intestate, that just simply means they died without a will. They didn't have a will in place. And so the government now has to decide how we're going to get this property handed out or given to the heirs. And if there are no heirs, then the government takes the property and sells it so they have something to tax. So if somebody dies intestate, they die without a will, the government takes the property. Well, first they try to find the heirs. And in South Dakota, they go all the way out to the fifth cousin. And in the farming community I grew up in, I could take a rock and hit a fifth cousin or a third cousin, because we're all Johnsons, Bensons, Williamsons, Andersons, Hansons, Celiusons. So there's a lot of relation there. So they go out to the fifth cousin. If they can't find the fifth cousin, then they take the property and sell it. The other way is if the property's abandoned. If the property's abandoned, again, they're going to try and locate the heirs, but then they'll take it through this government power called Escheat. So if somebody dies testate, that means they die with a will. Very good. They die with a will. Intestate means they die without a will. Next, we're going to begin our discussion on personal property versus real property. Personal property versus real property. Not only in the test world, but in the real world, you're going to need to understand the difference between what stays with the house and what the seller can take with them when you go to list a property. There's certain items that are going to be attached. That's going to be considered real property or a fixture. And there's certain items in the house that are personal. The seller is free and clear to take with them. Now, if there are items that are attached, let's say a ceiling fan. If the seller would wish to take it with them, they can. They'd have to just make note of that on different documents that we'll go through later and make sure that all parties know that the seller, before or at closing, is going to take that with them. Okay? A couple things to think about with that is make sure your sellers understand what by textbook definition is attached and what isn't. So they don't just assume that I can take the drapery rod with me or I can take the flat screen TV with me. Okay? Secondly, let's say they just bought a brand new ceiling fan and it's fancy. I mean, and it even sets off the room. And you can see why they bought it. You can see why they spent $680 on that ceiling fan, because it just makes the room. But the sellers are in love with that ceiling fan. I mean, they made postcards of that ceiling fan. They love it so much and handed it out to strangers in the mall. So they love that ceiling fan. Here's the thing that will probably happen. If you love the ceiling fan as the agent and the sellers love the ceiling fan, chances are the buyer will love the ceiling fan. And if it's not disclosed that it's staying, the buyers are going to expect, or going with the seller, the buyers are going to expect that it stays. And secondly, even if your sellers say, alert, alert, we're taking it with us, and everybody knows, there's a good chance still when it comes time to negotiation that the buyers are going to ask the seller for that. Even though the seller made it clear that we're taking it with them, chances are the buyers still could ask for that ceiling fan. And if you put the sellers in a corner and push them, and the sellers are desperate to sell, there's a chance they just might give up that ceiling fan to get the deal done. So here's the thought. Before you even get to that point in negotiations, have the seller take the ceiling fan down and replace it with the old one. I know they have to put up with that old one, you know, that was their original with the house back in 1984 for the next 60 or 90 days while it's on the market. But again, there's a good chance that the buyers could ask for it and the sellers might end up leaving it there and walking away without it. So just something to consider. So when it comes to personal property and fixtures or real property or property that's attached, there's going to be this 5-prong test that we're going to use to discover which is which. So just to recap, we have real estate, which is the land and the improvements or attachments. The real property is the interest that's held, or land plus improvements plus bundle of sticks. And then we have personal property, which you'll see two new definitions, or I should say words, that we can use interchangeably with personal property. The first one is chattel. We don't use that word here in the Midwest, but if you ever watch shows like HGTV, you'll see them use different words. Depends on if they're down in Texas or if they're in Louisiana or New York City or San Diego. They have different real estate jargon than we do. It's not that they're more sophisticated, it just means that they have just a different way of saying it. So they might call it chattel while we call it personal property. In other areas of the nation, they could call it personalty, and you'll see that as well. So, for your national exam, which is the same national exam that you'll take and somebody in Rhode Island will take, they're going to cover their bases. So, they might use the word chattel. You just need to remember that that's talking about personal property. I got a video, here's my video, from an agent. I didn't get it, I got it off YouTube. He didn't send it to me. But he, in this video, he just took a little handheld camera and videotaped himself in his car explaining the difference between chattel, he uses the word chattel here, and stuff that's attached. I thought it was a pretty neat way to market himself because he's explaining something that's a common question that sellers have. Most realtors like to market themselves by putting their listings on Facebook, and this is something outside the box. It's a tool that will help. And then when you're on YouTube and you're Googling questions, guess what? His video comes up. So let's watch his explanation. Well, on the purchase agreement, it says that the sellers agree that if it's working now, it's going to be working when you close. The home inspector will discover, they test everything. The home inspector will run the garbage disposal, they'll run a load, not a load of clothes, but they'll run the washing machine, they'll run the dryer, they run everything. The ice maker, make sure that everything's working. So it depends on how the Minnesota contracts are written, but it's, to me, it should, if I'm representing a seller, I would make sure that it's disclosed that this fridge isn't working. And it's a funny thing that the deals you put together that you think this is going to be flawless, you know, it's just going to be a cake, walk in the park, and it turns into a nightmare. And the ones that you, like a house you list or a buyer you start working with, you're thinking, this might take a while. It's done before you know it. So you can't always predict just based on the situation that it's going to turn out okay or not. So this is the 5-prong test. It spells out the acrostic Maria to help you gauge if it's going to be considered an attachment or personal property. So if I go down to Lowe's or Menards and I buy a ceiling fan, the second I swipe my card and it says approved, it's mine. It's personal property. I throw it in my trunk, it's personal property the whole way home. I take it out of the box, put it on the bed, it's personal property. But the moment I have it installed and I flip the switch, fan starts spinning, it's now part of the house. It's fixture. It's real property. So the first one, M, for manner of attachment, is it easy to remove? Is it easy to remove? For instance, pictures. Most pictures you hang on the wall with just a finishing nail. This dry erase board, I didn't use a finishing nail to hang it. I had to screw big bolts and things into the wall. So it's attached. I can't just pick it up and take it with me. The A is the appropriateness of the use intended. So an example of that, and if you're in the business long enough, you'll see this if you haven't seen it already, but sometimes a homeowner will tap into their gas line and they'll run a separate line out to the deck where they hook up their gas grill. Ingenious idea. I never have to run out of propane. That's one of the most frustrating things. You're grilling a nice fat juicy steak and then you run out of propane. It won't happen unless you don't pay the gas bill in those houses, because the gas just runs continuously to their gas grill. They cannot take that gas grill with them because there's a separate line running to that, and it's intended to connect with the gas grill. I don't care if they bought the gas grill at Sears and it's a Kenmore and it's this, or it's like a $5,000 Weber grill. We have a gas line running from the house. It's intended to connect with this grill. Even though the grill has wheels and I can move it around, once it's connected, it's part of the property. Okay?
Negotiable?
It's negotiable. Everything is negotiable. But again, up front, we want to let our sellers know this is going to be something that's considered attached to your property. If you want to take it with you, let's make sure we disclose that you're taking it with you. Otherwise, it's just going to be assumed that it's a part of the property. Yep, just wheel it into the garage. You can do that.
That way?
Yep, because now you don't have it connected.
Oh.
Now it's not connected
I thought
anymore.
just because the connection was there, and the grill was on the deck, but it's in the corner. that it-
No,
Assumed-
sorry, as long as it's connected.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah, I guess, but if you look at, let's say, a furnace or a heater in the garage,
Yeah.
that one could become a little bit more arguable, because you mount the heater up to the ceiling or on the wall, and then you run the gas line to it. Just because you maybe unhook the gas line doesn't mean that heater, even though it's still hanging on the wall, doesn't mean that is now yours. First off, the way that it's attached to the wall, again, you're not using a couple finishing nails, it's attached. But it's just inches away from the line, so even if it's not connected, there still could be the argument that it's going to be an attached or a fixture. This example ties in with this appropriateness that we just talked about, and the next one, which is the relationship of the parties, and it's something, or it's not something, it's called a flat screen TV, becoming more and more popular in houses today. But does a flat screen TV just magically hover above the floor, or is it attached? It's not attached to the wall, right? I don't just get out the super glue and just slap it up against the wall until it dries. It's attached to a mounting bracket, but the mounting bracket, the way that it's attached, the method of attachment, is it done by a finishing nail or is it attached? It's attached. What good is a bracket without a TV? I mean, isn't that why I'm hanging the bracket? I'm not putting it there so I can do pull-ups on it or I can hang my wet laundry. It's there for my flat screen TV. So, it's one area that isn't a gray area when we define what's an attachment or not, but it's an area that can be overlooked. Because I just paid $2,500 for this 60-inch Mitsubishi, and I'm not, Super Bowl's coming up, I'm not leaving that. And even looking at it in the property management world, tenants in apartment units, they have flat screen TVs, right? They'll attach them. By all technicality, the tenant should have to leave that there. Now, what happens? The tenant just yanks it out and takes it with them. But we're not talking about the real world and those things that happen. I'm trying to gear you for the test world. And so by all technicality, a flat screen TV, because of how it's attached and the bracket system, it's going to be considered a fixture. So if I look at number 3, which is the relationship of the parties, again, this also ties in with the flat screen TV. But let me give you another example of that. Let's say you move into a house and the owner, shortly before you bought the house from them, they put in a nice granite sink, but they left the old faucet on there. And so you live in the house for a couple years, and that old faucet just drives you bonkers. And so you head down to Menards, and you buy a $350 Moen faucet, just a real beauty. And you go and put it on that sink. And I mean, you love that faucet. And you just, every time after you wash dishes, you just shine it just because it's just beautiful. So when it comes time to sell that house, guess what? That faucet is going to stay, because you can't use a sink very well without a faucet. I think most of us would understand that, but how well can you use a flat screen without the bracket, or vice versa? Okay? And then number 4 is the intent of the parties. Did the person installing the item intend on it to be easily removed? So when I put that ceiling fan in my bedroom, did I use double-sided tape to mount it so I could just take it off and move it around? No. I, again, used the proper bracket system so that it stays and it doesn't just fly off the wall and decapitate my kid, right? It's there. And then number 5 is the last letter in Maria, A, and it's the agreement between the parties. And what this means is, what does the contract say? So this comes out in our world when we put the offer together. What do the contracts say? Are we agreeing that it stays, or are we agreeing that it goes? On that same vein of attachments, we have 2 different things primarily in the agricultural arena that can either stay or go. It just depends on the nature of that item. So the first one, and these are items again that are attached by the roots in the agricultural arena. We have fructus naturals. These are going to be considered permanent. These are going to be considered real property. If I said trees, we would pretty much agree that no homeowner is going to rip up that tree and take it with them. Now, what if it's the tree that they planted 2 years ago? It's still it's a baby tree, and it's the one that they planted as a family on Arbor Day. That's special, but it's going to stay with the property. If they want to dig it up and take it with them, again, we need to discuss that. We need to have it. I would suggest then do it before we list the house, so it's not even present. So that doesn't really happen that often. But what you may see, and does happen, is the little old lady the night before closing going out and digging up all the tulip bulbs before she closes on her house or sells her house. Yeah. But tulips come up every year, right? That's attached. Even though it's a lot easier to get a tulip out of the ground than a tree, it's attached. Okay? So, hey, take your tulips with you. I know maybe they're award-winning tulips, but, dig them up before, and so that's not even part of the picture, or disclose it. And then number 2 is fructus industrials. And you see the word after that in parentheses, which is emblements. Please highlight that. What are trade fixtures? Trade fixtures are things like this dry erase board. I already explained how the dry erase board is fixed to the property. It's attached, so it's something that is a part of the real property. It stays with the property. But actually, I can take this with me because it's considered a trade fixture. It's part of my trade as an educator to use this dry erase board. Some other examples of that, some more common ones that you could see, are a dentist and the dentist chairs in the office. Dentist chairs are not Velcroed to the floor, okay? They're attached. They dig holes into the cement, or they may even pour the cement with the bolts sticking up. These are attached to the ground. But it's part of that dentist trade, and so when they leave that space and move on to another one, they get to take those chairs with them. Okay, so that's a trade fixture. So that would also be considered, even though it's a trade fixture, it's considered personal property. Okay, so this is personal property. So if you have a question that says, which of the following are considered personal property, and you'll see something like real property, a fixture, a tree, and then you might see a trade fixture, and you're like, well, that says fixture in it. That's not personal property, but it is. So a trade fixture is personal property. And then lastly are leasehold improvements. And these are fixtures or improvements that are installed by the landlord, or even could be installed yourself. But the point is that they stay with the space. So, for instance, in here, if I was to replace all the carpet and paint the walls, when I leave, I can't take the paint and the new carpet with me. That's an improvement to the leasehold or to the lease space. That stays. If the owner went in and put in all new cabinets and sink and faucet system out in our foyer area, that would stay. That is not specific to my trade. I don't need a sink to teach a school, although it's helpful for making coffee. I don't need it. Okay? So it's not considered a trade fixture. It's a leasehold improvement, whether I did it or the landlord did it. The point is that it stays with the unit. And then lastly, to finish out, acquiring and losing ownership. So we have two ways, voluntarily or involuntarily, which makes sense. I can voluntarily give up ownership, or I can involuntarily give it up. And you'll see that word alienation following those two words. And all that word means, alienation, you can write this off to the side, is transfer. So I can voluntarily transfer land, like if I stick a for sale sign in the yard and I just give it to the highest bidder. Or I can involuntarily transfer land, like when the government takes it. Okay? That's against my will. Involuntary alienation. So, the three examples, or three ways you can voluntarily transfer, is by purchase, and that's what we're going to deal with in the real estate world. By a will, I can transfer property because it's inheritable, so I can transfer it by a will. How I do that is through what's called a devise. A devise is how I transfer real estate or real property. We're going to look at two separate words in this real estate course. One is devise, which is what we just talked about, transferring property through a will. And then the word demise. So we're just replacing the V with an M. And demise has to deal with leasing. We'll look at that later and explain it in more detail. But you could see them both on a test, and you need to know that devise is transferring property with a will. Demise is dealing with leasing. And then number 3 is by descent, or somebody dies intestate, it's going to be transferred to the next heir. B, involuntary alienation. One example of involuntarily transferring land is through adverse possession. You can lose ownership of the land that you have because someone occupies it for a hostile, continuous manner. In South Dakota, that's 20 years. If they have successfully met those requirements, then they can bring what's known as a quiet title suit, and basically the possession or the ownership, the bundle of rights, will transfer from your hands into theirs. I do have a short video to explain that.
Public policy encourages the use of real property rather than just letting it sit there. Therefore, there is a concept in the law called adverse possession, whereby someone can actually acquire ownership of land that otherwise doesn't belong to them by using it in a certain way. In order to gain ownership of property by adverse possession, the user must basically treat the land as the actual owner would have or should have, and must use the land exclusively. Also, the adverse possessor must not hide his or her use of the land. Rather, the use must be done openly and notoriously, and adverse to the actual owner. These requirements are partially intended to make at least everyone, including the actual owner, aware that the adverse possessor is using the land so that the true owner can fight for it if so desired. If the adverse possessor successfully uses the land for the number of years defined by law, then he or she could acquire title to the property. If you're involved in a property dispute or have questions about adverse possession, please understand time is of the essence. Seek the advice of an attorney as soon as possible so you can best protect your property rights.
It is for the landowner to just allow somebody to do it, but see, that would be voluntary. And so the landowner has to fight for it to get it back. But they have to usually go through some kind of legal process to get that person to stop using their land. So let's say we have farmer A and farmer B, and we have this fence line here that separates the two property boundaries. I got to put in my corner posts there. Yep, otherwise that's not going to stay up. So, but this is how it would look. It's not where A just so happens to, let's say A and B take down the fence, but A just kind of accidentally farms another, 10 feet into B's, because they really don't have a line anymore. They were using the fence line all those years. That's not going to be adverse possession. But if A just deliberately starts farming all the way into B's ground like this, to this degree, in this hostile, open manner, he does it for 20 years, then he can file that quiet title suit, and this now would become his new, or the total sum of his land. That's how that would work. But you can bet your dollar that B is going to fight that, and they're going to basically come in there and through legal action, maybe use the local authorities at first, but whatever process they can use to get that land back into their possession. Number 2 is color of title, where it appears that one party has title but not on paper. So an example of that is where someone shows a title document to real property, but in reality they have already deeded it to another party. There could be something with the title that, again, shows that if I look at it at face value, I have these sticks. But when the title search is done and when we look at the reality of it, I don't have these. I've already given title or ownership to somebody else, so I don't even have the ability to pass title on to you or to somebody else. Let's say you willed, in your will you gave the property to your kids that you had lived in, but let's say you had worked out a contract for deed with the owner. You never even had a true mortgage on it. It wasn't even in your name on the deed. And upon your death, it goes to them, but it's really not even yours to give. So your kids get the property, they start moving in, or they put the house up for market, or for sale, but it's not theirs to sell. The deed actually belongs to the true or accurate owner. An easement by prescription is similar to an adverse possession, but it's for a use. And so let's say we have these lots. We have a street below them, and then across the street is this school. So we have a vacant lot in between these two houses. And let's say there's this worn path coming out from the alley that's been there for 20 years. Let's say it's been there for 25 years. In fact, it's the worn path that the kids use to get to school. And in fact, it's used so much that the city put a little crosswalk at the exit of that path into the street, because it's used so frequently by the kids. So you have parents who have kids that use this, that they used when they were kids. Okay? So this vacant lot, at one day or someday, let's say 25 years after this path has been used or continued to be used, gets sold. According to this easement by prescription, the new owner would have to allow for some sort of pathway through here. Whether they put it along the property line like that, they keep it the same as it was. However they decide to implement it, they have to provide passage through this easement by prescription. And an easement, which we'll look at here on another class day, is a non-possessory interest held by one person on the land of somebody else. You look outside in the agricultural community, sometimes farmers' fields are kind of landlocked, so they have to go through another field or a pasture that's not their own to get to the field. And so that's an easement. They're using somebody else's land for their driveway. We have utility easements, right? If you have an electrical box in your backyard, the utility company has the right to go back there and access it. Even though that's your property, there's an easement there that they can access it and do any repairs that they need to do. And then finally is a dedication. So we looked at voluntary, involuntary alienation, and then we have dedication. And so we're familiar with property in this area that's been dedicated to the city. More commonly, parks. And in most towns in across the Midwest or even the U.S., you'll see parks that have names on them like McKinnon Park or Sherman Park. And that's typically the name of or last name of the person that dedicated it to the city. So that concludes chapter 2